Hello, comrades. Welcome. My name is Stan Doyle-Wood, and I am the instructor for new, or rather CSE444, Anticolonization and the Politics of Violence. I think what I will do is, in this introductory lecture, just go over the syllabus first, and then perhaps then touch upon some of the early material, going over the syllabus, taking a look at the reiterating on the syllabus the assignments, what the assignments are asking you to do, and then looking to weave some of the perhaps the material and speak to some of the early material in at the same time. And what I will tend to do is also weave my own story in as we go through the course. So the course, thinking about the course and thinking about weaving my own story into the course itself. We are in the second term of the summer session. So basically running from the beginning of July to August the 10th. So we're looking at roughly 6 weeks at the most, and this is the way in which, of course, these summer courses are condensed, right? They're condensed in terms of you try to cram in 2 weeks in 1 week. What I will be doing, which I find to be quite impossible in terms of its any potential for deep learning. You know, it becomes a sort of form of a fast food, you know, swallow, digest. You can't even begin to reflect upon what you've swallowed and digested. You just do that. And you just then pass, you know, take up those assignments that are required, and then you come out with, at the end of the day, you know, trying to figure out what you have what you might have learned, right? You know, how far further on your knowledge has moved. In fact, what on earth, you know, the knowledge was about in the first place, right? And this, of course, is the capitalist market-driven nature of education. What I'm going to try to do is to avoid that, rather than cram in 12 weeks in less than 6. I will try to go, because of course this not only increases my anxiety, more important that it creates anxiety for yourself, right? I find it injury-inducing to the body, right? And of course education has been one of the main spaces for the production of violence, excuse me, in these neoliberal, capitalistic, colonial, social and political systems of power, right? They're very much embedded in the power relations and the way in which these nation-states, Western nation-states, organize themselves, right? So I want to be speaking to that, right? I want to be speaking to what it is that constitutes violence, right? And let me talk about that in a moment as we go through the syllabus. So what I will be doing then is looking to stretch weeks out, perhaps cover 2 weeks of material in 1 week, but not to go over necessarily every single piece, but rather tell a story that allows us in some ways to breathe with our whole bodiness. So I'm not going to be starting one section, finishing off here, right, and then moving on, right, moving on to this point, right. We'll be telling a continuous story. Um, and it may well be that as we go through, we will work on um, 6, 7, 8 weeks of material, but stretched in such a way, as I said, to encompass everything that we would normally take up in a full 12-week session. Right? Everything about a course like this, right, is storytelling, right? And each and every time this course is taught by myself, it is never the same course. It just always takes on a life of its own, in a sense. It always directs itself. So what I want to, I suppose what I'm trying to say at the very beginning then is that is to practice a form of nonviolence in the sense, as pedagogy, right? This method of teaching, method of learning, right? The language of our body is my relationship to you, even though we're on this within this asynchronous format, right? A pedagogy of nonviolence, right? Practicing nonviolence. And I'll talk more about that as we go along. I'm not talking about Mahatma Gandhi here, right? I'm talking about the refusal, right, to reproduce the violence that is the colonial state, right, in everything that we do. Right? And at the same time, I am also going to be problematizing, right, the politics of violence, right? This politics of violence whereby the state itself says to those who resist its violence by any means necessary, the state calls that violence, right? Whether it be bricks, Molotov cocktails, whether it be fists, whether it be language, right? The state consistently defines what is violence and calls that resistance in all of its expressions violence, right? Just as it calls the effects of these violent social and political systems, right? The effects being the pain that it causes, the injury that it causes, the spirit injury that it causes, as one of our pieces of material talks about, Adrian Wing, right? That concept of spirit injury. Right? It doesn't call that violence. What it does is, it doesn't cause its implicatedness and complicity in the cause of that violence. But what it does do is call the effects, right, of that trauma, the way in which perhaps our bodies react to our world. It calls that violence, right? Just recently on the news, we talk about, I hear on the CP24, this corporate parasitism 24/7, right? Delivered to 24/7, right? 24 hours, 7 days a week. This corporate parasitism, right? It consistently looks to racialize, use race and racial thinking, right, to explain the problems in society. It speaks just this past couple of days about guns and gang violence, right? Language that it has, along with its also the corporate media as a whole, has nurtured a racializing component aspect to that language. So when we think of guns and gang violence, we immediately think of a particular body, right, in a particular community, in racial terms, right? Being introduced and indoctrinated into believing that there is a threat there and what it looks like, right? Why we must take these make these decisions, right? Take these actions. Policing, incarceration, right? Surveillance, and so on. And we do not call that violence, right? But at the same time, what we're getting there in that storytelling by the media, that what oftentimes academics talk about as discourses, right? These statements and ideas and these stories, right? These conceptual ways of thinking about the world, right? These knowledges, right? Produced for us, right? Rammed into us, right? What we are getting, what we're becoming naturalized into believing, right? So we don't question it anymore. Is what violence is and what violence is not. Right? So these are the areas in which I want us to be thinking of and challenging. If we're thinking about anti-colonization, we want to be able to thinking about freeing ourselves from those forces that have told us who we are, what we are, how we must understand our world, what violence is, right? And we must understand that if we are going then to liberate ourselves completely from those constraints, those colonial constraints, right? That impact our bodies, that tell us to do how we should behave, right? In every single aspect of our lives, right? How we should relate to one another, right? And what the real cause is, importantly, what the real cause is, right? Of our pain and our conditions are, right? And if we can pinpoint that cause, then of course we move along the pathway of then refusal, and we move along the pathway then of liberation when we refuse, when we reject that. Then we begin to find alternative and oppositional ways of being, right? Ways of relating to ourselves. Right? I mean, I was on the recently in a conversation, institutional conversation about looking to refuse, right? To disseminate and to build and nurture an understanding and knowledge base within the institution of refusal when it comes to calling the police, right? Not going to save us, right? Not there to take care of us, that institution. It is there to do us harm, right? It is there to kill us physically, emotionally, psychologically, right? It is there to brutalize us. And I was on in part of this conversation. Part of some of my thoughts were drawing on a previous conversation, whereby a member of the committee, a committee that rather a committee member that had come to speak about some of the findings of our institution here. I'm talking about the U of T. Had made a reference in relation to mental health about the police and how the police were not equipped to deal with mental health crises and did not know what they were when they arrived at a particular scene, or when they were called and then they arrived at a particular scene where the crisis was occurring. They did not know what they were going to be confronted with when they got there. And I attacked that. as whites and colonial, right? And the thinking of a neoliberal society, you know, and a neoliberal mindset that believes, in a sense, that everything is good, everything that is in place is all that is good, right? There is good intentions. We just need to tinker away with it. We just need a little training here and there. And my point being that that is this institution of violence that knows full well what it is doing when it goes to a particular community, a particular postcode. And where, in some sense, it believes it is going into white space, it is confronted with a racialized body. It knows full well, a priori, what it is going to do. And it is going to brutalize, right? And it is going to disregard, right? And it is going to dehumanize. And it may kill, right? And you think of the violence there of a body that is in positions of authority that can regurgitate that shit, right? I'm triggered by that. Right? As I said in this particular meeting, I was triggered by that and having to respond to that. Because when I think about the killing, the murder of a young man such as DeAndre Campbell, murdered in his kitchen, who called the police, right? Having a mental health crisis, and called the police, right? To help. His family did not know. And they come and murder him in his kitchen. And I know the family, the thinking of the family that says, you know, we're always afraid, right? Young black man, right? Navigating mental health disabilities, right? Navigating schizophrenia, right? What that means for that young man as a parent when you're afraid for your child when your child goes out into on the street, down the road. You're afraid because, not because of your community members, you're afraid because of these authoritative forces, such as represented by the police, who are going to brutalize your child, right? As they did with Elijah McClain, right? As they did with Emmett, right? We've just seen now talk of Emmett. Again, Emmett comes up with the warrants found now, the arrest warrant found in the basement of the courthouse. That courthouse in 1955, right? Where they exonerated all those killers of Emmett, all of those who were either physically responsible or responsible just by being there. Right? It was a very virtue of being whites and white supremacists. Right? And I know that as a parent, I know that fear of your child going out, because your child is a child that is targeted, the child's body is targeted by this state that is viewed, that produces itself as progressive, as non-violence, right? And as freedom-loving, right? I know how the fear of being relieved when your child comes home unharmed physically, and also importantly unharmed psychologically, right? So for DeAndre Campbell's parents, they felt that he was safe in his home, right? They felt that he was safe, just as I know many other families in similar situations too, right? Indigenous, black, racialized families, right? Families of disabled children, right? Families of children of difference, right? Trans, right? Underclassed, right? Disabled, race, class, gender, sexualized, right? All of those bodies that are consistently targeted for differential treatment by the state. You feel safe. You feel that your home is safe. And what happens is, in this particular case, as in so many cases, the state still comes for you, right? The state still comes and brutalizes you, right? And kills your children, right? Physically, psychologically, emotionally, and by extension, you, right? And that's political, of course, because there is a long political history of this. There is an agenda of this, right? Begins first with keeping the colonized in that place through fear and through terror, right? And yet not called violence. And my point being that when I hear that, then I am triggered by that. When I hear that, what I maintain is I feel is a violent response, right? And it's denial also, right? And it's murderous innocence, and it's murderous colonial white privileged nature, right? That triggers me, because we know that then what the authority, what the power structure is laying out here is still a continuation of this violence, and then a refusal, a gaslighting refusal to acknowledge it, right? It is only that body that can believe that the police are going to come and be a friend to it, right? And that's, in and of itself, again, not understood as violence, right? But many of us know that, right? So the question being is then how then we're thinking about how do we oppose that? How do we liberate ourselves from that? It becomes then a question of articulating for ourselves on our own terms, right? Through new language, our understandings, right, of our world, right? Our analysis, our own understandings of where we're coming from, where we're going to go, and how we are going to deal with these conditions in this particular moment, right? And how we're going to respond to those situations, right? Those violent presences, right? So much of this then, it leads me to thinking about the concept then, which we also talk about then, of decolonization, right? So a lot of the work that we're talking about, this course, is anti-colonization. It is anti-colonization because what it is saying is that there also needs to be a fight back, right? So decolonization sure means that the body that I'm talking about there needs to decolonize themselves, right? But that is not enough because, of course, without a fight back, an opposition, and a going to confront colonization, there can be no decolonization. There is no decolonization without anti-colonization. Right? And that then is a local and a global struggle, because of course we are talking about a global system, right? It means then that if I am engaged in, as that, if we think about the body that I've just been talking about, engaged in the practice of decolonization, you do that not on an individual basis, you do that on a community basis, but it is not enough. It is no arrival. It is a process, and it is a process by which then we also begin to refuse any form of complicity when it comes to brutalities that are occurring outside of our own community spaces, right? It means then that we create comradeship with struggles against oppression, colonialism, imperialism globally, right? So these are some then, perhaps I touched upon, looking to here to touch upon a few, some of the areas that this course is looking to engage with. So let me just go through then the syllabus, right? So lectures will be delivered asynchronously online. There'll be approximately 2 to 4 hours per week, beginning June 30th. 2 to 4 hours will be dedicated to lecture. Learning is self-paced and not reliant on a course meeting time. Lectures will be conducted on Thursdays and, barring any technical problems, uploaded on Fridays. Sometimes there are some technical problems. Of course, I upload my videos to YouTube and then provide a link in the course reading material list for the lectures themselves. So I'll be dropping in that course reading material list, that's where I'll be dropping the lectures, starting with this one. Office hours will be conducted synchronously via Zoom. Synchronous office hours will take the form of individually booked sessions. So you can call me, you can rather email me, better to do so, and I will try to meet your schedule as best as I can. Right? I know we're all working, we have many tasks and responsibilities, so I will do the best that I can to switch my schedule to meet yours. Right? For communication by email to myself, please use stan.doyle.wood@utoronto.ca or through Canvas. Emails will be responded to either the same day or the following day, unless I receive the email on the weekends or after 5 on Fridays. So, so if I'm getting emails on the Friday after 5, or I'm getting emails on Saturday or Sunday, it's likely that I will not be responding to them. It is, I also need to take some time for myself, in order to care for myself, and also to be with my family. But I will note that doesn't mean you should not send them. If you wish to send emails, you feel that you need to send it, just be mindful that I'll look at it on the Monday, right? If you send it over the weekend, right? Assignment submissions, all assignments can be submitted to me, my email address in Word format, please. Okay. So course description. In this advanced seminar, I invite a critical equity reading of violence, non-violence, and the praxis of decolonization. The praxis being theory, reflecting on that theory, and then to take action, right? Comes out of Paulo Freire's work, anti-colonial educator, well known for pedagogy of the oppressed, and education as the practice of freedom. This course will interrogate how the theorizations and embodied lived experiences and lived resistances to structural violence can be applied to create social, epistemological, ontological, and political decolonizing anti-colonial transformations. Some big words there. I'm sure you're familiar with them. I will talk about epistemology and ontologies, epistemological violence, right? Epistemic violence. Violence that is done to our knowledge base, the wiping out of our cultural and community driven and unbuilt knowledges, right? The wiping out of our ways of knowing and ways of doing. Right? Epistemology, looking to talk about knowledges, thinking about knowledges that teaches how we come to know. Right? This is what we use. We internalize, right, and we forced to digest Western theoretical frameworks, right, that teaches about knowledge that teaches how we come to know what we know, right? And how we come to know what we know, so we then can begin to reproduce that knowing for the further generations, for the next coming generations, right? For our futures, right? To continue, right, our existence, right? Knowledges that teach us how we come to know, right? Knowledges, we think about myths, we think about storytelling, right? I mean, I was telling a story earlier, just at the beginning of this, right? That is epistemology, right? Knowledges that teach us how we come to know, or knowledges that teach us how we come not to know, right? Knowledges that teach us how we come to be, we're talking about ontologies, right? I go back to that particular body. Knowledges, ontologies. That is an ontological moment, right? How you have been constructed to by a whole set of knowledges, to believe, right, in the innocence and the of the police, the necessity for the police, right, and the belief that they are there to protect us from harm, from violence. Where does that knowledge come from? It has to come from somewhere, right? So, and it is violence, right? When we talk about, when we get into talk about multiple forms of violence, right? Again, we're only thinking about violence in one particular, well-defined by the state mode, right? One particular, well-defined by the state instance. We know what it looks like. I throw a brick. I'm in the Andre Campbell's kitchen. The police come into me. I throw a brick at them. I'm the one that is violent, right? So the ways of knowing are ways of knowing in terms of that we perhaps have inherited, in terms of how to analyze that moment, right? That gives us language in order to critique that, right? To critique the contradiction that the police come to save us, right? But don't, but kill us. To feel and to take hold of that contradiction, to express with our whole bodies that contradiction means that we entails a whole set of oppositional knowledges, right? Epistemologies, right? that are not the epistemologies, the knowledges of these political and social systems, right? They are the knowledges of the oppressed, right? Carried on from generation to the next, right? Through action, through our interactions and our experiences and our navigations of these brutalizing colonial systems of power, right? And we pass that on. So they will learn to read and learn to see. I say see, but in an ableist sense, see with and feel with our whole bodies, right? And develop the language that allows our whole bodies to articulate what's going on, right? How we can make sense of it, and therefore how we can resist it, right? How we can resist falling into a state of helplessness and hopelessness, right? And subjugatedness, right? The wiping out of that, those knowledges, is what in our readings, Gage Spivak talks about as epistemic violence, right? Another expression of violence by the colonial state, right? Which again, oftentimes we steered away, right, from being able to confront, see, feel, know. Because of course we've been given a different language, right? The language we've been given does not allow us to analyze our world from that particular space, right? The wiping out of our knowledges that create, that represent and speak oppositional and alternative ways of understanding our world, our relationships with our world. The wiping out of that is also the wiping out of a people, epistemic violence. Right? Epistemic obliteration of our ways of thinking, ways of knowing, ways of doing, but it's also physical, genocidal violence, right? You disappear our ways of doing, our ways of being, our ways of knowing. You disappear a people. So let me return. This course will interrogate how the theorizations and embodied lived experiences and lived resistances to structural violence, and this is what we're talking about, structural violence, right? The state, the colonial state, likes to talk about violence and gives us this definition of violence that is both a violent, tactile, physical, doing physical, tactile damage to the state itself, to its buildings, to its properties. And also, it looks to have us understand violence at the individual level, right? At the individual physical level, right? Where we slap each other, perhaps, right? We engage in individual conflict, right? And every time it reproduces its own definitions of violence, each time what it does, of course, is it deflects and gaslights its way out of any attention being brought to bear on structural violence itself. And the nature of structural violence, right? And how it inhabits our world, right? So this course will interrogate how the theorizations and embodied lived experiences and lived resistances to structural violence can be applied to create social, epistemological, ontological, and political decolonizing anti-colonial transformations. Some key questions that we ask are, what does it mean to decolonize? What is decolonization? If decolonization is a healing, transformative, soul-filling, spiritualizing foodstuff, then what are its ingredients? A major component of liberation in colonial relational context is the reclamation of voice. It is about speaking in relation to our whole embodiment. So essential question is, in the context of colonial relations of power, how do we come to speak or not speak? How sure can we be that we are speaking when we speak? And what does this even mean? Right? So there's a couple of points here that have me be thinking here. You know, the necessity to call out and to confront, right? The structural nature of violence, and the definitions by the colonial state of violence that have been forced into us, right? To confront that, to contest that, to problematize that. And we see perhaps some of the consequences for failure to do this is that even as we think about you go to the United States, you think about some of the movements towards social justice. Over the years, it has always been, more often than not, been a call for social justice that looks to make the United States itself, this colonial power, this colonial violent structure, more caring of minoritized people, so-called, right? Of the marginalized, so-called, right? And so you tinker away with that. This is neoliberalism. You tinker away with that, right? The system is all that is good, right? Us competing with each other, right? Scrambling over each other. Capitalism starving some folks, right? Leaving folks to die, right? That's all very good. As long as it's not me, please include me, right? Make a few reforms, a few bits of policy here that can perhaps allow me to vote here, right? And meanwhile, stop its violence, right? Curtail its violence, right? And meanwhile, even if that's arrived at, the state itself, in all of its imperialist identity, goes and bombs and invades and does mass murder in the name of this progressiveness, in the name of its non-violence, right? There is violence over here and it's a threat to us, right? And we've given you this piece of policy and we've given you that, and look how progressive we are here, right? But we have to do this mass murder over here, right? And it's been successful in forcing the vast numbers of the population to give consent to that, right? The other point here, so if we refuse, if we're serious about non-violence, right, that means we are speaking about a refusal, right, to engage in violence in any form, locally, globally, in any form and expression it takes, right, in its colonial form, right? Where we think about in relation to anti-colonization, we are also at the same time not discounting the necessity to resist by, as Malcolm said, any means necessary. Right? And what we'll find in our material is that, and I would argue this, that is not violence, that is self-defense. And there is a difference between self-defense against colonial violence, right, and colonial violence itself, right? So these are some of the conversations that we're going to be talking about, we're going to be taking up, right? I want to be taking up in any conversation about the politics of violence, right? So there is a politics to violence, right? You cannot take this concept of violence outside, right? Uncouple it, right? Outside of these colonial relations of power that we find ourselves in, right? That we are navigating, that we are resisting. we're being killed by. So that central question in the context of colonial relations of power, how do we come to speak or not speak? How sure can we be that we are speaking when we speak? What does this even mean? So we're moving towards and thinking about Gertrude Spivak's famous piece in our first sections of material, Can the Subaltern Speak? And so what we're talking about here is speaking with our whole body, our understanding of our world, our thinking about our world, right? Are the ways in which we explain what is going on, or we are taught to explain what's going on, right? Even as we are resisting, we analyze colonial violence, we know it, right? And we resist it. We feel we do. But when that resistance is an expression, it is in a whole-bodied articulation, right, of our opposition, perhaps, right, of our understanding. Our body is speaking. Right? Spivak's point is that even in moments where we are resisting oppression, how do we know we are speaking? Right? We are speaking back. Is it the colonizer that is embedded in us that is manipulating us still, right? And as Spivak's piece takes up, right, in that moment where Indian working class women are practicing resistance, right? Is that resistance still heard by working class women, oppressed, colonized women themselves? Is it heard, or is it misunderstood? Is it read in a way that it was not intentional? Is it read in a way that is defined by colonial thoughts and colonial thinking, right? In the case that Spivak makes, right? Resistance is still being read collectively as a sacrifice to male power, right? On the part of women. Right? That particular piece, I'll say more about that piece, but I want us to be thinking about, you'll notice the pages, it's a long piece, right? But if we move from page 90 towards the end, then we really get into what Spivak is referring to, right? At its simplest form, in its simplest form, if I am practicing my anti-racism, and I'm doing it in a way that still continues to keep, right, the racist state in place, then the colonizer is still speaking through my body. It is still manipulating my thinking, my actions. Right? If at the same time I'm also think that perhaps the state is all that is good, and some people really are violent and need to be incarcerated, right? That's my politics. Then I'm not speaking. I think it's me, but it is the colonizer still that is talking through my body. Right? If I'm ableist, if I'm transphobic, even as I'm a social justice so-called warrior, it is the colonizer that is speaking through my body, right? So the important aspect of this then What Spivak is telling us then, and regardless, there has been a good many critiques of that particular paper, but what the importance, the key aspect for us is then we begin to think about how is it, what are the ways in which we have, how we speak, how we articulate ourselves, what are the ways and what are the multiple ways in which perhaps we thought it was our voice. We think about the concept of coming to voice, right? We are to speak whole-bodily on our own terms, right? Free ourselves, right? From all of those constraints that have been imposed on us and in us, right? You know, indoctrination of the public state education system, right? What Spivak does then is, the questions here are then, we begin to move towards that, down that pathway of liberation, because we're beginning to think about the multiple ways in which the oppressor has forced us to give consent to our own oppression, right? Forced us to do damage to ourselves, right? Forced us into a state and a space of helplessness and hopelessness, right? So we cannot resist, right? Forced us to believe, perhaps, in our own, in what it claims is our inferiority, right? Forced us to believe in this politically constructed violent representation of ourselves, right? So then if we begin to think about how we have been forced not to speak, right? Even when we're speaking, we're not speaking. It is not our voice, right? Right? I think about my own background. I think about the Caribbean. I think about societies. I think about my own communities, such in Trinidad, right? My own peoples in Trinidad, right? I think about the movement towards independence, you know, in the early 60s, right? I think about that movement with the flag coming down, right? And the Trinidad flag going up, right? And that's independence, and everybody's liberated. And my family members are being brutalized, right? As a result of colonial, enforced, patriarchal violence, right? Assault, violation, right? Along the line, gender-based, along the lines of sexuality, right? Brutalized, right? And yet we're independent. Fuck, are we independent, right? When we're all speaking, we're all talking liberation, we're all free, colonizers gone, flags up. Listen to me. Are we speaking? Are we speaking on our own terms? Are we articulating ourselves from a space of freedom and liberation? So let me carry on. Let me carry on a little bit now, a little bit further here. So the overarching theme of this seminar is to bring a broad conception, interpretation, analysis, and understanding of violence for the purpose of and for understanding and practicing individual and collective liberation in the context of coloniality and historical and ongoing colonial violence and colonial relations of power. Right? That's quite a mouthful there. At its core is to engage in a conversation about self-defense and what self-defense means in relation to community, collectivity, and individual and collective struggle and resistance to colonial violence. Right? Some questions are, how do we define violence? Who gets to define it? What are the implications for internalizing colonial definitions of the term concept? How does one separate the violence that occurs at the macro level from the violence that occurs at the micro level, or what is often termed lateral or horizontal violence? Right? That whole process, the whole point about the corporate parasitism, 24/7, CP24, like guns and gang violence, so-called, right, is all about this pathologizing, right, of particular communities who supposedly engage in violence, right, amongst themselves, right, as if it's some part of their our DNA, right, and that is considered to be violence, and that must be policed, right? It must be prioritized, and there must be prioritized neighborhoods, right? Right? It's a problem, right? It needs to be corrected, needs to be fixed, needs to be treated in a way that doesn't harm them or the rest of us. A colonial, race-based, right, relationship, right? Remember, we'll go to Frantz Fanon's The Problem of the Colonized, right? The colonized that are a problem that needs fixing, needs correcting, right? Right? And that, again, those conflicts talked about as violence, understood as violence, right? In this racializing conceptual framework of thinking, right? So we want to create a relationship between structural violence and its effects, that implosiveness, as my dear colleague who was recently passed away, Lee Miracle would say, and talk about it, that as not as violence, but rather implosion, right, and implosiveness, right, because of this structural violence imposed upon a people, right? And I like that. I agree with that. I don't want to understand. If you're thinking about how we come to speak, it means that we have to create new knowledge. How we come to speak outside of the constraints of the colonial master. We create new knowledge, new language, right, for ourselves. New knowledge, new language that emerges out of our interactions with these colonial systems of violence, right? So we create a relationship and understood, and we think about then the connections between structural violence and this implosiveness that occurs. Occurs as an effect, as a logical consequence, right, of this. And if, thinking about new language, we then make the decision to say that this is not violence, right? That lateral, that is implosiveness. It is not violence, right? Think of the shift then in our thinking, right? Think of what that does then. That shift. Spivak. Can the subaltern speak? The subaltern is beginning to speak. The oppressed are beginning to speak when we forced to ask them different questions. That is not violence. So what is? What are the causes of this? What are the consequences if we call that violence, right? Then it's on us, right? We are the problem, right? But if we're not the problem, where and what is the problem, right? It's a starting point, right? So when we're talking about anti-colonization, where is the starting point for liberation, freedom? Starting point is the individual and the collective self, right? The individual never separate from the collective, right? At its core is to engage in a conversation about self-defense and what self-defense means in relation to community, collectivity, and individual and collective struggle and resistance to colonial violence. So let me just bear with me as I repeat this, right? I'm just going over, and it also generates thinking when I go over this. I know you've read this, right? But it also generates questions in my own thinking and my own embodiment, right? How do we define violence? Who gets to define it? What are the implications for internalizing colonial definitions of the term concept? How does one separate the violence that occurs at the micro level from the violence that occurs at the micro level, or what is often termed lateral or horizontal violence? And of course, it is not to separate. It's to create and understand the relationship between the two, right? Right? Is this even violence? Can they in fact be separated? And if so, what are the implications for decolonial, anti-colonial practices? Okay, I think we talked about that there. When state-sanctioned institutions function to blatantly allocate power and privilege to the very few, while denying the majority access to their basic human rights and dignity, how can we condemn any act by the majority to subvert violent institutional practices? Where is the place for anger and rage? Remember, our anger and rage, the anger and the rage of the press, constantly spoken about and labeled as violent and violence, right? And we internalize that, right? When we internalize that, are we speaking? Right? When we talk about amongst ourselves, right? With our own communities, with our collectivities, in relation to oppression, I'm angry, you're angry, they're angry. You need to just calm that down, right? You can't be like that, right? Tone it down. You've got to stop your anger. Are we speaking? Or is that the colonizer that's talking? That's the colonizer that is talking, right? Not us. There is an old, it reminds me, I'm reminded now, the great revolutionary, Jose Marti, Cuban revolutionary, Jose Marti, once said, and Jose Marti was talking about the education system, that the colonizer, colonialism, is like the head of an ant, placed on the body of the colonized. And each time, gradually, the head of the ant gets bigger and the body of the colonized gets smaller. Right? Now the head of the ant can get bigger and bigger. That colonizing ant can get bigger and bigger and bigger to the point where it consumes the colonized. And it may well still look like the colonized. But even if it still looks like the colonized, we know full well when it is speaking, it is the colonizing ant that is speaking, right? Right? Consumption, right, of our whole embodiment, right? What Spivak is speaking about, of course, is that, we're still intact, right, physically, right? But we can neither speak outside of these colonial ways of thinking, ways of knowing, ways of doing. And even when we do, we've consumed those ways of knowing and ways of doing so much that we cannot even hear ourselves, right? Members of our collectives, when they are speaking outside of them, right? When they are speaking in oppositional ways, right? In alternative ways, right? We don't hear them, right? So the first point then of liberation in an anti-colonial sense is to deal with that, right? Work with that, right? Where is the place for anger and rage? How might we define it, understand it, practice it, reclaim it in relation to self-defense? One of the goals of the seminar then is to complicate and reconceptualize the current conceptions, understandings, and interpretations of violence. Furthermore, the seminar is aware of the usual tensions and binaries that people attempt to create between violence and non-violence, as though these terms are mutually exclusive. The seminar is not about making judgment between violence and non-violence. That is an interesting line there. This course this course used to be, I've taught the course for about 7 years now. And prior to that, when it first started, it was a course that was strictly, of course, working uncritically through Mahatma Gandhi's principles of nonviolence, Satyagraha. And when I inherited, I worked at this and felt that was problematic. And so I worked to both begin to contest that, the very course itself, and then gradually started to unravel it and take it apart, right? So it became a completely different course. It still has some contestations there, contestations with those that Gandhian understanding of violence, right? Non-violence rather, which has been instrumental in, has been very influential in shaping the course of civil rights actions over the past 60, 70 years or so, right? But generally, the course is, so I wanted to contest that, right? There's an importance, there's a necessity, as far as I'm concerned, to contest that, right? Because that is also dominance its way, right? Of telling us that that's the right course for protest, right? That's the right course to take up social justice work, right? And I would disagree with that. So much of this course has been taken apart. In fact, almost all of it. But there was one line here. This seminar is not about making judgment between violence and non-violence. That is still, as I read it now, it is still there. This course is going to make judgment between what is violence and non-violence. I spent a good deal of time doing that, right? So, think about that. Think about that line, right? And what it's asking, what are the effects of that, right? This course does make a judgment. It makes an evaluation, right? It makes a contestation, a critique. That line says no, right? That line leaves structural violence intact, right? And it creates an equivalency, right? In a sense, right? It can serve to create an equivalency between protest, self-defense, and violence, right? An equivalency between perhaps the violence of the state, the violence of state actors, right? Or supremacists, and the violence of the oppressed, right? And not to take a stand here also does not allow us to really fully understand the structural nature of violence, right? And the ways in which these concepts play out in our daily, day-to-day lives. So there is no room and no luxury, right, of being able to stand back and have a nice theoretical argument, right? We don't do that. This, of course, is not about that. So I'm just looking at that now. I'm just taking a look. I haven't taught this course now for a year. And I looked over this, but again, I missed that, right? It is, you see how we can be, how we can easily we can be manipulated by language, right? Right. Language in it is embedded with meanings, right? Embedded with conceptual ways of knowing and doing and being, right? Shapes our and influences our understanding of the world, right? And our relationships to one another and everything around us, right? No one can fully understand what nonviolence is without first understanding what violence is in the first place and what it is not. Within this context, the seminar explores critically the pervasive philosophical ideas about violence, nonviolence, and decolonization, their contradictions, and how these ideas intersect to complicate activism in contemporary education systems. In this sense, the philosophical thinking of Mahatma Gandhi, Stokely Carmichael, later became Kwame Ture, Martin Luther King Jr., Frantz Fanon, Assata Shakur, Malcolm X, Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, Ward Churchill, Elaine Brown, Huey P. Newton, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, John Akomfrah, and others form a relevant space to search for alternative ways to reconceptualize and respond to violence as it relates to self-defense and the self-defense of the individual and collective self. The general goal of this course is to pursue a deep understanding of the politics of violence and, by extension, decolonization, anti-colonization, and anti-colonial self-defense as a process and as a lived praxis, right? So here we then get into some of the, let's get into some of the assignments. Please note, and this is speaking here to the assignments, that multiple forms of Englishes are invited as languages when it comes to responding to the requirements of the assignments in this course. It is important that we write and speak in a way that is comfortable to us. So, write and speak then. Articulate yourselves in any way that is comfortable for you, right? This is not, these assignments are not asking you to start with a thesis statement and this kind of thing, right? Don't bother with that. You just go straight in, right? If you are feeling, you'll notice these assignments speak to the I self. I'll come to that in a moment, right? But however you want to begin, however you want to talk, however your body wants to talk, right? Because we're not separating our mind from our bodies here when we use language like talk, right? If I want to say fuck, right? This is fucking hard, right? I haven't been asked to do a fucking assignment like this. Then say that, right? Right? Because this is your body then beginning to, that's how your body naturally speaks, right? Right? And begins to articulate what is going on around you, right? Make sense of things, right? Right? I'll say more about that, but that is what I invite you to do. These assignments also, in this course, there is also a guaranteed 1 week extension on all assignments, right? But what I will ask of you is that you just email me to request an extension, right? So again, you don't have to provide documentation to me, right? Just ask me, or any kind of explanation. Just say, Stan, I need an extra week. Can you give me an extension? Yes, right? That is guaranteed. Right? That will be the answer, yes. No problem, right? So we have assignments 1, 2, 3, and 4. July the 8th to the 22nd. Both the 3 and 4 are, you can hand those in on the August the 10th, which is the last date. Now I'm going to extend that date, right? So don't get too upset when you see that date. When I say too upset, I mean it looks like everything's really going to be crammed in here. I've got some wiggle room there towards the end, but I'm forced to provide a date The last date I'm supposed to provide is the last day of classes. Now, I will, as I say, I'll be looking to extend that date, right? But I'll talk more about that, right? So, description of assignments. Assignment 1, introductory reflection on the concept of violence, due July the 8th, 10%. Each student is required to submit a one-page single-space reflection. So, one-page single-space, right? Single-space. Reflection and analysis on the concept of violence. I've used the word analysis here, right? Perhaps I shouldn't have used that word. What I'm saying is just to think about it, right? Your reflection. Let's not get too confused, perhaps, or too bothered too much about the word analysis. Just say what you think. You're thinking, right? Anything you've heard about in terms of violence, right? What do you come to know about violence, right? And at the same time, you're going to draw a little bit on 2 pieces of course material, right? From both week 1 and week 2, right? So the week 1 and week 2 are combined, right? You have all that work on Windrush, on the uprisings in the UK throughout the 60s and 70s, Handsworth in Birmingham, and then you have further material that I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, right? So any 2 pieces of that material. You also have the problem of the colonized, right? That quote by Fanon from Black Skin, White Masks, right? On that refusal to amputate my body, right? Cut away the multiplicity of my body, right? We can draw upon that, right? Yeah, 2 pieces, right? Wings, spirit injury, right? Right? So situating the I, i.e. situating the self, is a key requirement of the assignment. So the I self. I've said that we can do this with both hands. It's not either. I'm talking about your individual self here, I, right? It doesn't mean that you have to tell your story, your personal story. I'm finding this fucking hard, right? I come at something like this. I come at this lecture. I'm not perhaps feeling too. My body, I mentioned being triggered before, right? Those are the blood memories in my body. They're beginning to talk, right? They're beginning to feel pain, right? The story of Emmett, it generates pain. It generates pain because that has been the story of also my collective, right? The brutalization, violation has been the story of my collective, particularly when it comes to children, right? And my own children. Those memories in my body are evoked. They appear. They're in front of me, right? They're a part of me. They at times they may tie me up and make me feel helpless and make me feel hopeless, right? So when I come to this, and I have to also then begin to re-talk back to my own body, right? To move away from that, right? And yet I'm here to do this lecture, right? Where do I start? I start by saying that. Right? This is how my body is feeling right now in this moment, right? Oh, I simply find this hard. I've been asked to do this before. Start with that, right? If you're a living, breathing human being, right? Then you cannot, there is no way not to start, not to think of yourself, right? The I. Bring emotional subjectivity to bear, right? Acknowledge, right, our emotional subjectivity. Right? I'm going to talk more about that, right, in a moment, later on, right? So again, it doesn't mean that if we're acknowledging our emotional subjectivity, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're asking for a personal story, right? Because that's not, maybe for many of us, that's not where we're at, right? If you wish to do that, then that's fine too, right? So the course material in context of this course also includes lectures, poems, videos, as well as readings. And we'll see there's a few videos also in this first section, week 1 and week 2, right? Hayib, right? I think the piece for me is speaking about a story of police brutality coming to voice, right? And you think about, playing this material off against each other, right? Or reading some of the material through the material itself. We really think about Spivak and we think about Hayib, right? Young Muslim child going into school for the first time. When we think about and talk about violence then, where is violence? Where is structural violence? It's in the culture of that school, right? That forces that child to amputate her difference, right? Forcing that child to speak in very colonial, defined terms, right? Placing boundaries around speaking, right? Of what that child can say, how that child can live her life, right? Identify herself, right? And relate to her world and her people, right? Assignment 2, critical reflection on the film The How Did They Come by Hensel and Rohn. Two single space, asking for two single space, two single space response. Right? So 2 pages, single space. Excuse me. Getting a little bit tied up. My tongue is getting tied up here. Body tongue. Similar to assignment 1, that is July the 22nd, and again we talk about you ask for. I know everybody has multiple responsibilities, multiple commitments in your lives, right? So if that doesn't work for you, then you say, Stan, I need an extension, right? Similar to assignment 1, again an analysis reflection of the film. The How Did They Come? This assignment entails a critical analysis of the film through the lens of Frantz Fanon's first chapter concerning violence in Wretched of the Earth, pages 35 to 95. In other words, you are reading the film through Fanon's chapter. Here you will look to pinpoint and reflect on 4 examples in concerning violence that you find to be echoed in the How Did They Come. Again, situating the eyes. Eye is a key requirement. So any 5 examples that you see in the How Did They Come, or in Fanon's chapter there, that you see being echoed, either there are instances being echoed in the How Did They Come from Fanon's chapter, right? Or the other way around, you might say what is going on. There are some instances, right? 5 instances, moments in the How Did They Come that Fanon is beginning to work through, right? That Fanon is spoken about, right? Right? So either or, right? Right? Or it can be both and, right? Right? And of course, what I will do is I will also be speaking more to that, right? In that chapter, right? As we move along. So assignment 3, critical reflection on the self. 3 pages, single space reflection. Due August the 10th, I think we talked about that. This is worth 30%. The assignment 2 worth 25. I see it's not in bold there. Okay. So assignment 2, 25%. Assignment 3, 30%. Critical reflection on the film Black Sheep by Cornelius Walker and Ed Perkins. This assignment requires the intersection of a minimum of 5 pieces of course material from the section, the self. I'll put those up shortly. I already have Walker and Perkins's Black Sheep already up there. There's a link to that, right? Material in other sections can also be brought in to supplement these 5 pieces, with the exception of the film's Hands with Songs. So please don't use Hands with Songs, or you know what? Or the harder they come. Handsworth songs. What I did was I've used a discussion about Handsworth songs, and Handsworth songs is about the speaks to the Windrush generation, this large wave of migrants from the Caribbean to the United Kingdom in the late 1940s and through to the 1950s. It speaks to that. Handsworth Songs by Gianna Confra. It's an experimental film. And it also then, but it is also looking at the historical context behind the uprisings in Handsworth, Birmingham in 1985, an uprising that emerges, that erupts out of constant actions of harassment and brutality by the police against primarily black folks in Handsworth, but racialized folks right across the board, right, and particularly working class, black and racialized folks, right. But what I've done is I couldn't get the film, so what I've done is I've used pieces that we find in the first 1 and 2 sections that tells that story, right, and tell the story from the standpoint of the oppressed, right, and also critique the corporate media's response, right, where the corporate media constructs those uprisings as violence, right, as an invasion by this alien force, right, and what is then the consequence of that, right? The consequence of that then is to generate the broader public to give consent to the brutalization of this threat, right? And of course, what we're doing there is also taking Fanon's The Problem of the Colonized, because of course the colonized are viewed as problem, right? Once you're viewed as a problem, then you treat that problem, right? In multiple ways, in multiple forms, right? All of which constitute violence, murder, genocide, right? So what we're referring to is just don't use let's not use the harder they come, because we've already talked about the harder they come. Let's not use that as a piece of course material for this particular assignment, right? But everything else, for sure, right? So 5 pieces specifically in the section, the self, right? And then if you want to draw on other pieces, for sure, yeah. Let's see now. Please note that any material used in assignments 1 and 2 should not be reused or replicated in assignment 3. Yeah, so if we're using whatever we used in assignment 1 and 2, I'm asking us not to reuse that assignment, that same material, and replicate it. I mean, sometimes that's what happens, right? You know, we've written this and we just transplant it over to this assignment. I want us to avoid that, right? I mean, we don't. If we do that, we don't extend our learning, right? To the extent that I would like us to. Right? So, assignment 4, final critical essay, August the 10th. Again, we talked about that, worth 35%. There will be no written test for this course. Instead, each student is required to submit a 4-page, single-spaced critical analysis paper about any topic of your choice related to the course material. And it's focused on decolonization as theory and practice rather, i.e. praxis. The key question for this assignment to be addressed is, in decolonizing decolonial context, what does it mean to speak? Again, drawing on Spivak here. What does it mean not to speak? What does that look like? What are the effects in this not speaking? What are the consequences? How do we come to speak in decolonizing anti-colonial ways, and in what forms? What does this look like in concrete terms? Students may relate their analysis to real-life concrete issues, i.e. organizing strategies of resistance, movements, etc., and material conditions of oppression, i.e. poverty, dispossession, police brutality, ongoing colonial relations of power, violence against women, racialized denial of place, space, the marking of bodies as a problem, the politics of resistance, violence, the politics of memory, the politics of healing, of spirituality, of spirit injury, of amputation, of anger, of rage, and of blood anger. And I will talk a bit more about blood anger later. The politics of speaking, however, must be named and centered as the central space on which your analysis is grounded. So we can begin with that, right? We can begin with those questions, right? Wrapped around speaking. What constitutes speech, right? In decolonial, anti-colonial context, right? Here you will draw and gauge your Spivak's well-known work, Can the Subaltern Speak, providing a brief explanation of what Spivak means by this and the context in which it has been taken up in the course. As I say, this could also serve as the entry point into your discussion. The term paper must demonstrate a full engagement with the course material. The situation of the I self is paramount. Using course readings, lectures, film, etc. as sources of reference is critical. This discussion and analysis must not be a copy of the discussions taken up in previous assignments. Students are welcome to use other related outside readings. However, this material must not outweigh the course material. 90% of the material you use should consist of CSE444 course material. A minimum of 10 pieces of CSE444 course material should be utilized, and at least one should be a lecture. I see new 444 is still in there. We see how young our new program still is, right? The change of name, Critical Studies in Equity and Solidarity, CSES. Okay, yeah, I've said that 3 and 4 can be handed in on the same date of August the 10th, although you have the option of handing in assignment 3 earlier if you choose. And there is a late penalty of 2% per day, including weekends. So as I say, email me in the case of any need for extensions. Okay. So I've said a bit about this course material in this week 1 and 2. The section is opening up with, there's a piece here, a video, or rather a piece, an image from Jonah Comfort's piece, Hands with Songs. And I want us to think then, when we're thinking about this material, along the lines of what it is that constitutes the structural nature of violence, right? This image alone is an image of the state constructing the colonized as a problem, leaving no room for movement, any movement whatsoever. It constructs the problem, the colonized as problem, and then refuses it any form of existence. It closes every articulation of existence, looks to close every articulation down on the part of the colonized. It looks to prevent it from breathing in a whole-bodied sense. And this is an image that, for me, represents that. Right? And this is the complexity. We want to talk about the complexity and the multiplicatedness of that, right? We're found in here in this very quote, right? Part of that closing down, right? Shrinkage, that consumption of the colonized that Jose Marti was speaking to, right? Is also provided, right? Articulated epistemically. But Fanon in this very moment, he is forced to, through his navigations of the world, to amputate the difference that is his body. Amputate the blackness that is his identity. Right? And be a black-skinned body. Right? but with a white mask. And that white mask is a whole-bodied mask, right? It is not only physical, right? It is psychological, it is emotional, right? And every single movement and articulation that you're beginning to police yourself, right? Amputate your difference, your multiplicity, right? Only speak through the constructions that the colonizer, of yourself that the colonizer has forced upon you, right? View yourself as lacking, as inferior. And in this moment, Fanon refuses to do that, right? I'm going to come back to this, right? I'm going to say a few things here, just touch upon a few things, but I'm going to come back to that, right? And I'm going to build upon this, right? We have Junior Mervyn's, right, following Fanon's problem of the colonized, right? Fanon's problem of the colonized, we see there for what is the cause of death, right? Fanon explains to us, right? It is the colonized, rather. Fanon is the colonizer to explain and articulate, attempt to articulate, but know full well what the cause is of our conditions, of our pain, of our injury. Wing, talking about spirit injury. It can't be treated. We cannot be given a pill for this. It is the colonial structure itself that kills us on multiple levels, right? So we have Junior Mervyn looking at the state agents, the arbiters of this violence, right? The police. Right? We have a clip here from Hansworth Songs. Two clips. Again, the media, again, the closing down, media representation both, and then the closing down of space, right? Windrush, I'm going to come back to and talk more about that. The Peace by Pride's Purge, again, we see the media in that construction, right, of the dangerous, right, of the colonized as a problem, right? We see here how that is constructed, right? Right? And how that is then becomes naturalized, right, in the thinking, not only of dominance, but also in the thinking of the colonized, right? You see that clip by Mark Duggan, right, who was murdered by the police in 2010, gave rise to the uprisings then in 2010 and 2011, right? That split, we know. You see the face, it was in all the newspapers of Mark Duggan, right? Dangerous, right? This gangster, right? And it's cropped, of course, to fit, to produce that lie, right? When we put the photographs, the crop bit, we match it up with the top half, we find that the pain, that is pain that Mark is expressing. It's the pain of the death of his child. Now, if we don't talk about that, if that is not violence, the construction of that, right? The exploitation of the sacredness of that moment, right? Forced upon all of us, right? Back on us. The desecration of the sacredness of that body, right? And of that pain and of that injury. If that's not violence, if that's not murderousness, I don't know what is, right? Part of what Fanon speaks about refusal, I refuse that amputation, is to refuse that, right? That movement towards anti-colonization, that movement towards speaking, the reclamation of the self, then forces us then, as I said before, to ask new questions, right? And when we ask new questions, it steers us towards a refusal to believe what the oppressor tells us, to believe the oppressor's stories. And therefore it drives our own research, right? It's our bodies that drive our research. Begin to ask those questions, begin to excavate, right? Begin to become our own archaeologists, right? We dig further. We want to know that our positional truth, the reality, the real truth. Right? Because our own truths, right, tell us that there is a contradiction here, right? There's always a contradiction here. Right? What would it be if the tabloids had not cropped that, right? What would be the outcome of that, right? What story would be told then? And what is the story that does not want to be told? That the media does not want us to hear, to digest, right? To consume. Remember, in the Windrush documentary, we also have there's also instances, moments where the state has come to do violence to the oppressed, particularly black folks in the UK, in the United Kingdom. When black folks have looked to develop, self-actualize, right, on their own terms, right? That brutality has been in closing down gatherings and communities such as the Mangrove Restaurant in the late 60s, right, in London, terrorizing constantly, right, not allowing any movement, right? Looking to scoop up into imprisonment, right? Later, other moments in this particular documentary also speak to then instances such as the New Cross Fire, where you had children, young black children, partying and dying in mass, right? And the community arguing that this was murder, that this was intentional. And of course the state blames, is the problem, colonizer the problem, the state blames the children themselves for their own deaths, right? The state says nothing. Further violence, right? Disregard, right? Brutality. Your lives don't matter, right? Reinforced by instances that shortly after that fire in 1981, whereby white children have also succumbed, lost their lives as a result of some accidental tragedies. And the state has wept and sent condolences. The contradiction there, that violent contradiction, is also the articulation of the violence of the state, right? More and more violence penetrating the bodies of the oppressed, right? So that then moves, this documentary then moves up towards, and speaks then and moves towards the uprisings. Uprisings come in 1981 in Brixton, London, all across the UK, and then we get to that point in '85. What the media is doing, of course, right, when it argues that any form of resistance, right, is violence, it's removing the context, right, behind those uprisings, and we have to bring that context back, right? What I was thinking about, and what I was being reminded of, with that, the way the media violated Mark Duggan's body and that of his family through the cutting away of that photograph, desecration of that moment of mourning for his child who had died. Right? In the wake of the New Cross fire, the documentary talks about the march into London, a protest march, calling for attention, calling for investigation, calling for an acknowledgement, right, of pain and suffering on the part of black folks, right? Folks who are in the protest talk about how the media, walking down Fleet Street, the heart of corporate media in London, talk about how reporters called out, shouted out racist epithets from the windows. Right? So if we think we don't think there's no more blatant example, right, of the institutional racist nature, right, of institutions of power such as the media, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back on. I see it's 1:47, right? So I'm just I'm throwing out a few little pieces here, right? I'm throwing out a few, touching upon a few, some of the discussions, both in the material, but also connecting it with the theme of the course itself. Just for the moment, right? And it's not going to be my nature to go over every piece, right? And you will see and read aspects in this material that perhaps I haven't, right? But I do want to make some connections, right? And I do want to pose and pull out some of the contradictions that this material is exposing, in the contradictions that the state relies upon for its to maintain its power, right? It's contradictions between democracy, right, progressiveness, right, and its violence, right? Freedom, and yet it is by its very nature, its whole DNA, right? Is wrapped around violence. Right? Black Panther Party member H. Rap Brown, now Jamil Al-Amin, talked about, that very famous statement that violence was as American as cherry pie, right? It's built into its DNA, right? Can know itself outside of that, right? So if we understand that, we understand how it unfolds, how it expresses itself, right? How it penetrates our bodies also, right? Then we can fight it, right? The poem in between it is England style, is a coming to voice moment, right? An attempt to articulate, not in a theoretical sense, but in a whole-bodied sense, right? These social and political systems that have done damage and done violence, right, to me, right, and to my family, right, and to my collectives, and to my people, right. Speaking in a way the one is not supposed to speak. And if one is not supposed to speak in that way, if the state says we are not supposed to speak and articulate ourselves in that way, then we know fuck well we must do that, right? So I'm gonna leave it at that for now. And I wish everyone peace and love, and I will sign off.